Thank you, Gordon, again for joining us. It's a pleasure. It's a real honor to have you here. I know you're a busy man. Every time I turn on my TV, I think I see you on some channel, whether it's Fox News, NBC, and lately Newsmax. So thank you again for joining us.
Well, it's a real honor for me to be here speaking to you. So thank you, Joseph.
Absolutely. So Gordon, before we begin, let me give you a little bit about the show and the audience. As I told you off camera, our audience is primarily Latin American. It's mostly from anywhere from Mexico to Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, and also U.S. Latinos inside the United States. Most of them are becoming acquainted with China for, I won't say for the first time, but at least in the first time in a long time, because the image of China and Latin America for many, many years has been that of a commercial partner, an investor, somebody that comes in is basically trying to help countries boost their economic development. I know you obviously know much better than that. I know a little bit better than that. But give us first a glimpse, a little bit about why Latin America should be concerned about China beyond just its economic ambitions in the region.
Well, China really has ambitions which are neocolonial, as you've talked about. And that's absolutely right, because the Chinese believe that they are the only legitimate rulers in the world. They have this notion of tianxia, or all under heaven, that China's rulers, they not only have the right to rule all under heaven, but they are compelled by the heavens to do so. Now, this sounds ludicrous, it sounds absurd, but nonetheless, they've been talking more and more about tianxia in recent years, an indication that they believe that they can actually extend this system to the world.
So in that sense, if they see that, I mean, so how does that make them much different than, say, other theocratic regimes, religious fundamentalists like Iran, for instance, that believe that they have a higher cause, a higher calling? Are they falling in that direction with some of these more authoritarian theocratic regimes?
Yeah, China is not religious by any means. It's relentlessly atheistic, but it shares some characteristics with regimes like Iran's, because they believe that there is some overarching principle that organizes the world. And so therefore, that is similar. They are dangerous. They are totalitarian. China's moving back from authoritarianism to totalitarianism. And that's a real danger, because it indicates that there are a number of things going on inside of China that is causing it to act belligerently and provocatively. So basically, Beijing these days sees itself as having the right to do anything it wants. And of course, that can't be good for any country that it deals with.
So during the Trump administration, we were somewhat more engaged with Latin America. I know we're just beginning the Biden administration, but during the Trump administration, there were efforts to essentially warn Latin Americans about China's presence, not in any sense of trying to delegitimize China, but more in a sense of trying to outcompete with China and putting some realistic expectations to when these countries decide they want to sign onto these loans or infrastructure deals. And I remember Secretary Mattis, Defense Secretary Mattis, when he was the defense secretary under the Trump administration, I remember him actually speaking at the Brazilian War College, a very historic war college for U.S. Latin America relations. And he called it predatory economics. He said China has a vision of their economy and their economic trade much different than we do, where it's largely a zero-sum game. It's not a win-win scenario, as usually international trade is, where it's mutually beneficial and there's winners on both sides. It's a zero-sum game because China's looking to exploit. They're looking to take advantage. They're looking to find a way to gain a strategic advantage by this trade deal. So my question, Gordon, which you've seen this all over the world, you've seen this in Africa, you've seen this obviously in Asia, and more recently now in the Middle East. How does China use economics as a weapon? Is this part of how does economics fit? How does trade fit into their larger strategic ambitions? And if you could talk to us a little bit also about the military dimension, their military ties to their trade deals.
Yeah, China since about 2009, even before that, but in 2009, they started talking about using trade and their economic relations to obtain geopolitical goals. And we see this now across the span of what China's been doing. especially as they try to intimidate companies that are in China. But of course, they're trying to do that elsewhere because China has a view of the world which is very different. They don't really believe in comparative advantage, which is the notion that underpins global trade. As you say, they believe it is to be zero sum, and they believe that they should be able to export their products and that other countries should not be really entitled to sell to China except on China's terms, which indeed are extremely selfish. What with trade, we have also witnessed that China then goes out and uses, tries to install, for instance, equipment from Huawei Technologies, which is the world's #1 maker of telecom networking gear. China subsidizes Huawei equipment, and the reason is because it uses Huawei equipment to spy. Just to give you an example, from 2012 to 2017, China and the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia was nightly downloading surreptitiously data from the headquarters of this Chinese donated, Chinese built building, and they were doing that through Huawei servers. So that means that any country that has Huawei equipment in its 5G backbone, for instance, or just even in its telecommunications network, basically they're just sending information to China. And that makes it very difficult, for instance, for the United States to have robust relations, because we do not want to share our intelligence with a country that is sending it over to China. Not that they intend to, but that's really what happens when they have Chinese telecom equipment in their networks.
So that's interesting that you mentioned that, Gordon, because 5G has been a big conversation in Latin America. They've been pushing that quite a bit aggressively in some of the bigger countries, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina. And the countries that have resisted it, and I'll specifically mention the Bolsonaro government of Brazil, have resisted to just openly sign on to Huawei to be its main service provider for 5G, have met with a lot of resistance. Now, we can't draw a direct causation between some of the destabilization and turbulence and propaganda attacks on the Bolsonaro government that's going on right now with, the fact that they're having a difficult time in negotiating a 5G deal, or China's having a difficult time negotiating a 5G deal in Brazil. But there's definitely a correlation. The more Bolsonaro stands up to China, the more the press and everybody else starts to attack him and try to delegitimize his presidency. Is that a correlation, or is there more to that than that?
I'm sure there's more to it, because that has occurred in other nations as well. And with regard to 5G in Brazil, since you mentioned it, essentially what Beijing said to Brazil was, look, we will sell you our coronavirus vaccines, but you've got to let us have Huawei compete for your 5G network. And really, this is really what Beijing does. It's coercive in many ways. Now, China's vaccines are barely effective, and the most they're effective is 65%. Some of them are less. And because China has never released its phase 3 trial data, we don't even know if these vaccines are safe. But unfortunately, these countries do not have access to the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, because the U.S. said it's going to vaccinate Americans first. And that is unfortunate, because we're not exporting that. So the only vaccines that are available to some of these countries, which have really been hit hard by COVID-19, is really to get the Chinese vaccine. And Beijing is using its leverage in order to obtain other goals when it sells and makes available its vaccines. And by the way, China is not making its vaccines available to the Chinese because they're using it for geopolitical purposes, like they're doing in Brazil.
No, that's a good point. I think that's a good point. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Gordon, but both the defense and the foreign minister had to resign in the last 24 hours. A lot of it because the public pressure on how they've been dealing with the Chinese vaccine, with the Sinopharm and the other vaccines, that they haven't been resisting it, but they haven't been trying to take this lump package. They don't want to say, we're going to take the vaccine and all the other attachments to it, including the 5G deal. I'm gonna invite my co-host Maybor Petit to join us, because she's a Venezuelan journalist. She covers Latin America, organized crime a lot, particularly the cartels, and she's going to ask a few questions about that.
Hi, Mr. Chang. Thank you so much for being on Sin Filtros.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this.
Yes, I would like for you to explain to us, what do you think on the China-Iran cooperation deal, or the China and Russian cooperation deal, with them performing joint aerial and naval military exercises? Do you believe the USA is preparing to handle this situation?
This is one of the most adverse developments of the year, which was the announcement of the China-Iran strategic partnership over the weekend. In general, it's about a 25-year deal, $400 billion of Chinese investment into Iran. Iran, from what we can tell, is going to sell oil to China at reduced prices. There's some element of military cooperation. They mentioned that, but we don't know, of course, how extensive it is. The reason why this is important for a number, first of all, Iran is destabilizing countries which it has contact with. And it's not just the Middle East, it's, of course, in Latin America as well. China, either directly or indirectly, actually, I should say China directly and indirectly has transferred nuclear weapons technology to Iran. They did that through the Pakistan black market run by AQ Khan. But China's also sold materials for Iran's nuclear weapons program directly. So this has, of course, destabilized the Middle East, and it can destabilize any countries where China and Iran have relations. And both China and Iran are deep into Latin America.
Yeah. Actually, if I could just add one point to what Gordon's saying, because I think it's a very, very important point, that while this is new 25-year strategic agreement, is new in terms of the public relations aspect of it.
Yeah.
Not to say that China and Iran haven't been cooperating for many, many years. They've been triangulating that trade beyond just the oil shipments that Iran sends to China on weapons proliferation through North Korea. North Korea is one of the major suppliers of technology and parts for Iran's missile program, in which we know it's one of the major missile powers in the Middle East. So, Gordon, maybe you could touch on that a little bit, because where does North Korea fit in this? Because obviously they're another rogue regime and rogue actor. Does this bolster the North Korea-Iran nexus in knowing that North Korea has strong relations with Beijing?
Yeah, there's a group of countries that are actually working together, and they're basically supported by China. You got Iran, Russia, and North Korea. And, China, as I mentioned, used Pakistan to transfer uranium enrichment and nuclear weapons technology to Iran. Well, they're using North Korea to transfer ballistic missiles. You take most Iranian missiles, you scrape off the paint, and you got a North Korean one. And that trade has been robust. Beijing has protected it, and it continues. And, what makes a nuclear weapon dangerous? Well, you put it on a missile that can reach the United States or Latin America or wherever. And that's really what's occurring here. People say, and we don't know, but people say that Iran pays North Korea somewhere in the region of $2.5 to $3 billion US dollars a year for their various forms of cooperation. And this has really been North Korea supplying ballistic missiles technology to the Iranians. It supports the North Korean economy. That's about 10% of the North Korean economy, by the way. And of course, it makes Iran even more dangerous than it is.
What about Venezuela? China and Venezuela has been getting together for a while, and we don't know what to expect.
Well, China's extended loans to the Maduro regime. We're seeing to Hugo Chavez. This has really been one of the main props for Venezuela, and it's allowed it to continue to repress the Venezuelan people. Those loans, and again, there's no precision about this, but we're in the tens of billions of dollars a year. Some people say well over $50 billion. Now it appears that Venezuela has been able to reduce the outstanding balance by supplying oil at reduced rates. Again, very much like the Iranian deal, which was just announced. But clearly, there has been, for a very long time, China backstopping some of the most awful regimes on earth, including Venezuela's. And that'll continue because China, for various reasons, wants to have a footprint in Latin America, and it wants to support authoritarian and hardline governments like we see in Venezuela.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, because you could rewind maybe 2 years. And many people in Venezuela, especially in the opposition, were actually writing letters to China and saying, well, can you ally with us? Can you side with us against the Maduro regime? And I thought it was very naive, because I said, well, you're talking to Maduro, who in many ways is just a proxy of these bigger powers such as China, Iran, Russia. So, if basically you're telling somebody, can you work with me, when that entity, that country, is actually the source of the problem? And I thought that there was a lot of confusion on that in Venezuela. Actually, I think President Guaido actually wrote an open letter and published it in Bloomberg to Xi Jinping and the president of China, saying we could work together. And the argument was, if you work with us, we'll pay back your loans. If you work with Maduro, you're never going to get paid. And my response to that was that I don't think China poured all that money into Venezuela because they actually thought they were going to get repaid. I think they poured that money into Venezuela because they were colonizing Venezuela. They were actually acquiring something. They were acquiring access. They were acquiring, in some cases, territory. They were acquiring assets. And I think that's kind of like the story worldwide. So, like, tell me a little bit about this. Because even with the China-Iran deal, everyone says, it was at 400 billion or something, big number like that. If you're a market actor, right, Iran's not where you want to put your money. That's not where you want to park your money right now. High inflation, low production. It's been hit by the virus just like everybody else. So what does all these loans, does China ever expect to actually get paid back? Or is there a bigger play here that China's working with?
I think China would like to get paid back, but it knows it won't. And what it's been doing is debt trap diplomacy, as it's called. And perhaps the best example of that is Sri Lanka, where you have the port of Hambantota, basically Chinese-funded infrastructure. It never made economic sense because, remember, the China's Belt and Road Initiative that people talk about, this is building infrastructure that the private sector wouldn't touch. And so a lot of these projects are ending up to be just not viable. So they took over the port of Hambantota, and probably they're going to use it for the Chinese Navy, as they've been using the Chinese built and funded Colombo International Terminal, also in Sri Lanka. In your region, in the Caribbean, for instance, China is now building 2 port facilities in the Bahamas, one in Freeport and the other on the Abaco Islands. And neither of these projects, and they're in the billions of dollars, neither of these projects make any economic sense. So I think that China is going to try to turn those into Navy bases. For Americans, this makes a big deal because Abaco Islands are about 190 miles away from Florida, and Freeport is 87 miles away from Florida. So this is the pattern. And it's, of course, not just Bahamas. It's going to be all throughout the region where China's extending money. It knows that the terms are so onerous, it'll never get paid back. And it will use that for geopolitical leverage of one sort or another, perhaps the building of Chinese military bases, maybe the Chinese listening posts. We don't know what their ultimate goal is, but we do know that they do see geopolitical advantage in their extension of loans on onerous terms.
Yeah, Gordon, I think the head of Southcom, Admiral Fowler, recently testified before Congress. I know you read the testimony because you cited in your article, and he mentioned that China has 40 port projects in Latin America. So, just the ones in Freeport in the Caribbean, they have 40 other projects just like that in the south of the border. But I believe maybe we're just going to ask a few questions about cartels to wrap this up.
Yes, exactly, because you state that Chinese money brokers are working with the Latin American drug dealers or cartels. They are replacing Mexican and Colombian money laundering. So this is a statement that everybody wants to know more about.
Yes, there's, for instance, one Chinese money laundering gang which was handling the cash for the Sinaloa cartel, which, by the way, is also trafficking people into the United States at this very moment. But also this Chinese gang was working for other drug dealers in Latin America. And the Chinese are very good at it. They perfected ways of moving cash without actually physically moving the bills. They use burner phones, Chinese banking apps, all the rest of it. And basically, they are supported by Beijing. And we know that because the Chinese the banking system, financial system, tightly controlled by China. This is a near total surveillance state in China. So you just don't run large international criminal activities through China and Beijing not know about it. So Beijing knows about it. The question is, are they actively behind it, or do they just let it continue because they like it? But whatever it is, we know that China did not extend cooperation to U.S. law enforcement on these money laundering gangs. And that's a real indication that Beijing wants to do this. In general, the Chinese money laundering gangs are taking over from similar enterprises around the world. So this is dangerous because, as we know, criminal groups, terrorist groups, they run on money and they need the access to the global financial system. And Beijing is providing it to them through these Chinese criminal gangs.
They also working in United States.
They do operate through the U.S. And for one reason is they're transferring dollars. And every dollar transaction, other than cash, it clears through New York City, through the banks in New York. So they've got operations there as well. Or let me say, they're using the U.S. financial system to move this cash. So yes, they are in the U.S.
Wow.
I think honestly, we could talk. I think we could talk to you for hours. I think you're just a wealth of information. To wrap this up, given that Latin America is kind of now waking up to this China problem that the rest of the world's obviously also experiencing, what would be a recommendation, particularly to the governments of Latin America, because they're signing all these deals with China. It's quickly becoming the #1 trade partner of many countries in the region. It already is of Peru, of Brazil, of Chile, Uruguay, some of these South American countries. What would be your word of caution and your advice to say to these governments before they sign their deals, or maybe now that they've already signed them, how to manage through these deals to make sure they don't fall into these debt traps or don't fall into any kind of other shenanigans that the PRC might be trying to pull in Latin America?
Well, the basic advice is if a deal is too good to be true, it's not true. I mean, China wants something for providing loans or vaccines or infrastructure or whatever on below market terms. And obviously it's going to come back and haunt them because China tries to control governments around the world, including those in Latin America. And remember, the Chinese have this view ultimately that the Chinese race should dominate the world. This is extremely dangerous. We're seeing China in this whole notion of using race to try to divide societies. This can come to no good for anybody who deals with China. It's unfortunate, but China is communist. They mean it, and they are malicious.
Well, that's a very, very sound warning. Gordon, thank you again. Where can the audience find you? Where can they follow you? I know your Twitter account is at Gordon G. Chang. We're going to put it and post it on the video. But where else can they find you and follow you for all those that want to learn more about China and your knowledge about the issue?
Yeah, I post all my articles for free at my website, which is www.gordonchang.com, GORDONCHANG.com. And as you point out, I do most of a lot of my writing on Twitter. I've been dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century. So, I tweet because I tweet my articles out and I just tweet on recent developments because right now things are moving so fast. That's about the only way to keep abreast of developments in China, which are just overwhelming everybody, even people who follow China day in, day out for a living.
Absolutely. Once again, thank you, Gordon, for joining Seguridad Sin Filtros. To all the audience, please follow Gordon. He's one of my resources for understanding what's going on in China. I do follow him pretty religiously on Twitter. He tweets very prophetically. And you've gone into the 21st century quicker than I have, Gordon. I'm still struggling with my own Twitter account. But nonetheless, thank you again. We're going to stay up with your Twitter. We're going to stay up with your work and hopefully can have you on the show again sometime in the future. Thank you again, Gordon.
I would love to come back, and thank you, Joseph and Maybort. Thank you so much.